Have you ever looked at a Chihuahua next to a Great Dane and wondered how those ears, despite the huge size difference, let them hear similar sounds? We're going on a deep dive,
Yeah,
into the world of dog ears and how they hear.
it's pretty fascinating stuff.
You gave me this really cool article
Yeah.
that uses micro CT scans
Uh-huh.
to make 3D models of ears
Yeah.
of 18 different dog breeds.
That's right.
And even a wolf.
Mm-hmm.
They even scanned like the extremes, a Chihuahua and a St. Bernard.
Yeah, a Chihuahua and a St. Bernard.
Can you imagine those skulls side by side?
I know, it's amazing.
And then zooming in on those tiny little ear bones.
Yeah, it's incredible. The detail that you can see with these micro CT scans is really remarkable. So the study focuses on the middle ear. And just to orient everybody, the middle ear is that space that's right behind the eardrum. So the eardrum, also called the tympanic membrane.
Yeah.
And it also contains these three tiny little bones called the ossicles. And there's the malleus, the incussus, and the stapes. And these ossicles, they're arranged in a little chain, and they basically transmit vibrations from the eardrum to the inner ear.
So the middle ear is really all about converting sound waves into like mechanical vibrations that the inner ear can then process.
Exactly. And one of the really interesting things that the study looked at was how the size of these middle ear structures actually scales with the size of the dog. You might assume that like bigger dogs just have proportionally bigger ears,
Right.
but it turns out it's not that straightforward.
Okay, so what did they find? What's the connection?
What they discovered is what's called negative allometry,
Okay.
which means that smaller dogs have relatively larger ear structures compared to their head size
Oh.
than bigger dogs. So it's kind of counterintuitive.
Wait, so like a Chihuahua's eardrum would be proportionally bigger than a Great Dane's.
That's exactly right.
Wow.
Yeah.
Why is that important?
Well, it actually challenges kind of the simple assumption that smaller ears equal higher frequency hearing. So if that were true, you would actually expect smaller dogs to have smaller eardrums and smaller middle ear structures.
Right.
But that's not what they found.
So the relationship between ear size and hearing is not as simple as we think.
Not at all. And this study actually goes into some pretty amazing detail.
Yeah.
So like, for example, when they looked at the middle ear of a mongrel dog,
Yeah.
they actually found that the middle ear cavity was partially decided.
Uh,
And they even found this little bony nodule within the stapedius muscle. So the stapedius muscle is a muscle that actually helps control the movement of the stapes bone.
It's amazing how much detail these micro CT scans can show.
Yeah, it's really incredible. And it gives us this really deep understanding of the functional anatomy of the canine ear. Now, the study also touches a little bit on the inner ear. So just, again, to orient everybody, the inner ear is where the magic of converting those vibrations into nerve signals that the brain can understand actually happens.
Right.
And there are a couple of key players in there, the cochlea, which is that spiral-shaped structure, and the semicircular canals, which are involved in balance. And they even noted that there were some variations in the number of turns in the cochlea between different breeds.
Okay, so we've got this awesome anatomical tour of the dog ear.
Yeah.
But the real question is, how does all this variation in ear size actually affect what a dog can hear?
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting. So there's this idea out there that smaller ears are better at picking up those high-frequency sounds, like the ones that dog whistles make.
Yeah.
And that idea actually comes from observations across different mammal species.
Okay.
Smaller mammals tend to have smaller ears, and they also tend to hear higher frequencies. So it seems logical to assume that the same thing would apply within a species, right?
Right. Smaller structure, faster vibrations, higher pitch.
Exactly. But there's a study from 1983 by a researcher named Hefner
Okay.
that kind of throws a wrench in those assumptions.
Oh, really?
So he looked at the hearing capabilities of 5 different dog breeds,
Okay.
ranging in size from a tiny Chihuahua all the way up to a massive St. Bernard.
Wow. Okay.
And guess what?
What?
He found no significant differences in their hearing ranges.
What?
Despite these huge differences in size, he even actually measured their eardrums and confirmed that they did scale with body size. So according to Hefner's research, a Chihuahua and a St. Bernard can hear the same range of sounds, even though their ears are drastically different sizes.
Okay, now I am completely confused. How is that possible with all those anatomical differences we just talked about? Does this mean all those details about ear structure don't actually matter?
Well, not necessarily. It just means it's more complicated than we initially thought. Remember those audiograms I mentioned?
Yeah, the visual representation of hearing ability.
Yeah, exactly. So Hefner's study included those audiograms for those 5 different breeds.
All right.
And they're strikingly similar. So to kind of understand this apparent paradox,
Mm-hmm.
we need to kind of delve into some acoustic principles and how those tiny middle ear bones actually work.
So lead the way. I'm not a physicist. You might have to dumb it down for me a little bit.
No problem. So imagine you're trying to get a sound wave that's traveling through air to move through water.
Yeah.
It doesn't work very well, right?
No.
They don't mix. So that's kind of what's happening in the ear. You've got sound traveling through the air.
Yeah.
And it needs to be transferred to the fluid-filled inner ear.
Right.
And so the middle ear actually acts like a bridge
Oh, okay.
to help those vibrations transfer efficiently.
Okay.
And this is where concepts like acoustic compliance and impedance come into play.
All right, I'm listening. Keep going with that bridge analogy.
Okay, so think of it like this. Acoustic compliance is how easily a structure can vibrate.
Mm-hmm.
And impedance is the resistance to those vibrations.
Okay.
So if you think about like a loose trampoline,
Yeah.
that has high compliance. It vibrates really easily.
Right.
A really tight trampoline has low compliance.
Okay.
It's hard to get it to move.
Yeah.
So relating that back to the ear,
Okay.
the size and shape of the eardrum,
Yeah.
the middle ear cavity,
Okay.
and all those tiny ossicles we talked about,
Mm-hmm.
all influence how well that middle ear can transfer those sound vibrations.
So they all kind of work together to fine-tune that process.
Exactly. And one theory is that the larger relative size of those middle ear structures in smaller dogs
Yeah.
might actually compensate for the smaller absolute size of their ears.
Oh, so it's like they're fine-tuned to still get those high frequencies, even though the ear is tiny.
That's the idea.
Cool.
But there's a limit to how much these kind of simple models can tell us. At those really high frequencies, the ear is actually vibrating in these incredibly complex ways. It's not something that we can easily predict just based on size.
So it sounds like a super complex system happening in that middle ear. But you mentioned earlier that there could be other things going on too, beyond just the middle ear itself.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's possible that other parts of the auditory system, like the pinnae, the outer ear,
Okay.
could also play a role in shaping a dog's overall hearing range. Remember how Hefner actually taped a dachshund's ears flat in his study?
Yeah.
Even with the pinnae completely flat, the dog could still hear those high frequencies pretty well,
Ah.
suggesting that the middle ear might be more critical for those high pitches, at least in dogs.
Oh, it's not just about those floppy ears. It's
Right.
really the whole system.
It's the whole package.
Was there anything else in the research that stood out to you?
One thing that I thought was really interesting was this finding about Cavalier King Charles Spaniels.
Okay.
This breed was found to have disproportionately larger ossicles compared to their skull size.
Interesting. And they're also prone to ear infections, right?
They are. Now, it's important to note that they only studied one dog from this breed.
Right.
So it's just a single data point. But it does raise some interesting questions, like could those larger ossicles somehow be related to their susceptibility to ear problems?
That's a good question.
Yeah, it's something that definitely warrants further investigation.
More research is needed. It's amazing how much we're still learning about these subtle aspects of hearing, even in the species that we're so close to. Makes me wonder if they'd used more than one dog per breed, if they would have found even more variation within breeds.
Oh, absolutely. There's definitely individual variation, and that's one of the limitations of this study, right?
Yeah.
Using one dog per breed is a good starting point.
Yeah.
But it does leave the door open for future research to really explore those individual differences.
Yeah, it's super cool to think about how this research might actually change the way we think about caring for dogs.
Totally. It has implications for veterinary care and for breeding practices.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more.
Well, for starters, it really highlights the potential for these subtle breed-specific differences in hearing that vets should consider. So knowing that Cavalier King Charles Spaniels might have these proportionally larger ossicles
Right.
could be useful when diagnosing ear problems.
Yeah, take an extra piece of the puzzle.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, are there other subtle variations in ear anatomy between breeds that we haven't even discovered yet? You know, this research could be a springboard for more targeted investigations into specific breeds and their unique auditory needs.
That's awesome. Making sure we're giving them the best care possible.
Exactly. And then beyond veterinary care, imagine the potential impact on breeding practices.
Okay, yeah.
If we could gain a deeper understanding of how these anatomical variations relate to hearing ability and potentially to ear health,
Right.
breeders could use that information to make more informed decisions.
Yeah, instead of just focusing on looks or other physical traits, they could really prioritize healthy hearing.
Exactly, right.
Yeah.
It could even lead to the development of breeding programs that are specifically aimed at reducing the risk of ear problems.
Now we're talking. That would
Yeah.
make such a difference.
It really could. Think about the applications in working dogs, like search and rescue dogs.
Yeah?
What if we could breed dogs with even greater sensitivity to certain sounds, or working dogs that can hear commands really clearly in noisy environments?
Yeah, it would change the way we work with dogs in all sorts of fields.
Exactly. So this research might just be scratching the surface of what we can learn about canine hearing and its potential.
That's super cool.
It's a reminder that science is always evolving and there's always more to discover.
And our dogs still have secrets.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this fascinating deep dive,
Yeah.
what's the key takeaway for our listeners? What do we want them to kind of ponder as they go about their day?
I think the big takeaway is that we need to kind of move beyond those simple assumptions. The relationship between ear size and hearing in dogs is way more nuanced than we initially thought, and there's still so much more to uncover.
Yeah, this research has definitely challenged like what I thought about dog ears. Makes you realize there's so much more to these like everyday things that we see all the time. Absolutely. And it's a great reminder that science is a process of continuous discovery. Speaking of which, there's one more interesting point from the study that we haven't touched on yet. Remember how the researchers used mostly dried skulls for their micro C2 scans?
Yeah, and they had to estimate the boundaries of some of those soft tissue structures in the ear, like the eardrum.
Exactly. They relied heavily on these bony landmarks to make those estimations, which kind of raises the question of accuracy. Could those estimations have kind of skewed their findings a little bit?
Yeah. How do we know if those estimations were reliable?
Well, the researchers actually anticipated this question, and they addressed it head-on in the study. They had one specimen, a mongrel dog, that still had soft tissues intact.
Oh, cool.
So they used this specimen as like a test case, comparing their estimations based on the bony landmarks to the actual soft tissue boundaries that were visible in the scan.
Oh, that's smart. So what did they find? Did the estimations match up with the real deal?
For the most part, yes. The estimations for things like the middle ear cavity volume and the tympanic membrane area were only slightly larger than the actual measurements that they took from the soft tissues.
Right.
The difference was less than 10%. So it does suggest that their method was pretty reliable, at least for this particular specimen.
Well, that is reassuring. It makes me feel more confident in their findings about the negative allometry and the differences in ear structure size.
For sure. So going back to that million-dollar question, if those anatomical differences don't completely explain why dogs of different sizes seem to have similar hearing ranges, what else could be going on?
Yeah.
Well, the researchers offer a couple of really interesting possibilities. They suggest that maybe the constraints on hearing range might not be coming from the ear itself, but from somewhere else in the auditory system.
So not the hardware, but the software. Like maybe the brain is processing those sounds
Yep.
in a way that kind of makes it all come out the same.
That's a really interesting possibility. Or maybe there are limitations in how those signals travel from the ear to the brain. There's this whole network of nerves and pathways involved. And maybe something about the way that's structured in dogs creates this kind of standardization of hearing ranges.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So even if a Chihuahua's ear is better at picking up those high frequencies, maybe those signals get lost on the way to the brain, and it ends up being similar to what a St. Bernard hears.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like having a high-powered antenna that's connected to a low-bandwidth cable. You might be receiving a stronger signal initially, but you can only transmit so much of it.
I love that analogy. It really highlights the point that we have to look beyond just the ear itself. We need to understand that whole pathway from the eardrum all the way to the brain to fully get it.
Couldn't agree more. And that's kind of the beauty of science, right? One study often leads to more questions than answers, and it opens up these whole new avenues of investigation that we hadn't even considered before.
Yeah, this deep dive has really made me think about how much we still don't know about even the animals we're closest to, like our dogs.
It's a reminder that there's always more to learn, and that even our beloved dogs can still surprise us with their hidden complexities.
That is so true. So to wrap things up, what's the one thing we want our listeners to walk away with today?
Let's encourage them to approach the world with a sense of wonder and curiosity. Don't take anything for granted, even something as familiar as a dog's bark or the way they tilt their head when you speak. There's a whole world of complexity beneath the surface just waiting to be discovered.
I love that. It's about embracing the unknown and appreciating the incredible diversity and complexity of life, even in the creatures we think we know so well.
Absolutely. And who knows, maybe this research will inspire future generations of scientists and vets and breeders to unlock even more secrets of the canine ear.
That is a fantastic note to end on. Thanks for joining me on this amazing deep dive.
My pleasure.
And to our listeners, until next time, expert speaker and host speaker from Vet NeuroJar. Keep those minds inspired, hearts light, and tails wagging.